Hey everybody. I'm going to do a video today on the different versions of Warhammer, specifically on Army Project versus 8th edition. I will be doing some battle reports here using the Warhammer Army Project. And I wanted to, before I posted any battle reports, kind of go over the differences between Warhammer Army Project and straight up 8th edition. So if you don't know 8th edition, if you're new to the game in general, some of this may not mean anything to you. I'll provide a link in the video. You can go check out the Warhammer Army Project where you can download the entire rule set for free. So you can check it out yourself. I will say that the game of Warhammer, the core rules of Warhammer Fantasy, largely played out the same over the years, largely. There were minor differences that caused the play experience to differ. So just to give a brief summary, I started in 5th edition in 1998, and the big thing with 5th edition was the power of the heroes. The heroes were really what did most of the work at the tournament level. And people, I'll just preface everything I'm saying with, this is all from my experience, so I'm not trying to speak for the globe or for the whole world. So if I say this was how the tournament experience worked, that's how I saw it for my region. And so I went to the Baltimore Grand Tournaments, the Chicago Grand Tournaments. I did one in the Dallas area, and then I did a bunch of indies throughout the region. So that's my region. Now, I do know like the West Coast played a little bit differently, and I know the people in Europe played a lot differently because I've played against them, and I've seen the different play styles. So I'm speaking just in general from my region in the U.S. Essentially, that's the eastern part of the U.S. and the Midwest is where most of my experience comes from. So I'm not really into like arguing over it really wasn't this or because I'm sure both of us are right. I'm sure that to other people, that wasn't their experience. And, I'm not trying to take that away from them. But in my experience, it was about 5th edition was about heroes and the power of the hero. And what they did with 6th edition was really it was about army books. There were some changes to the rules, and I don't remember all the changes. You're talking about something that happened over 20 years ago, going on 25 years now. I don't remember all the changes, but primarily it was about the army power in the books, the hero power. My Chaos Lord used to have over 40 attacks, 40 attacks by himself on top of his dragon due to a combination of magic items and stat lines and stuff. And that was in 5th edition. And in 6th edition, you just couldn't do that anymore. Little things like Frenzy in 5th edition used to double your attacks, whereas in 6th edition going on, I think it added 1 attack and that's it, which was a substantial difference. Because if a model had 7 or 8 base attacks and they were frenzied, that means they had 16 attacks versus a +1 to their attack. So little things like that changed. 6th and 7th edition started off really balanced, and then as they introduced army books, things started to get a little janky. 7th edition became known to a lot of people as Cavalry Hammer, not because of anything in the core rules, I don't think, but it was more that they started letting heavy cavalry be core choices. And really that started with the Empire book where you could take heavy 1+ armor, which is the best armor you could get, heavy cavalry as a core choice, and also make them inner circle knights, which boosted their strength, and that was still a core choice. So cavalry was just seen as the optimal way to play. And even back then, once the internet was starting to get rolling, that whole concept of a meta, it took over a lot of communities, and not everybody, but a lot of people that's how they played. They played what they saw, and the internet blasted heavy cavalry armies everywhere. So that's kind of what everyone's experience, a lot of people's experience was. 8th edition, they introduced Steadfast to kind of get around the cavalry hammer, and that was one of their stated goals. They didn't like to see all of the heavy cavalry armies the way they were, and they realized, well, that's because there's no point in taking infantry. Because infantry get charged and get mowed over, and then they just break. So to counter that, they introduced Steadfast, which created one of the biggest problems of all Warhammer, and that was the mega blob, huge blocks of infantry, and that just turned a lot of people off. And really what it was, I did post a couple things talking about how I didn't think model count really had changed between 7th and 8th. And that's because my model count didn't, from like a Tomb King's perspective. But it was pointed out very accurately that, you know, a lot of guys, they just ran all cavalry armies. And those cavalry armies were, I don't know, 10 groups of 5 cavalry. If I'm looking at some of the battle reports I did in the past in 7th edition, it was like 10 units of 5 cavalry everywhere. It was a checkerboard. So it's 50 models, 50 cavalry models. And then now with 8th edition, they have to get infantry. They feel like they have to get infantry because, you know, competitive players not going to play something that's not competitive. And so they had to sell their army and buy all these infantry models, and they didn't want to do that, and they quit. So when you hear people talk about 8th edition being about, you know, more models, what you're hearing a lot of people complaining about, which is fine, it's valid, is they had this army of 50 cavalry models or whatever, and now that wasn't optimal. So then to be optimal, they had to get like the unit of 60 whatever on top of a couple other units of infantry or whatever. And to them, that, you know, that was adding 20, 30 models to the army. And they didn't want to do that. And, you know, and that was also the era of Tom Kirby, which is a whole other video we can do, which we're not going to do right now, and his philosophy on how to run Games Workshop. But all the price increases really started to get bad back then. Like today, when I look at some of the prices, I can't fathom wanting to play that game. But even back then, the prices were getting just really, really bad, and they were taking models out of the box. So you used to be able to get a box of 20 infantry. Let's just put it this way. I could buy a box of 20 skeletons back when I started for $20. And then they ended up, you know, it went down to 16 models in the box and then 10 models in the box for $35. And I don't even know what it is now. But anyhow, those little changes to the core rules made big impacts on how the game was played. Now, I've mentioned 8th edition was not my favorite edition. In fact, if I were to stack rank my favorite editions, it would be 6th edition first, followed by 7th editions for its core rules, followed by 8th edition, followed by 5th edition. I'm not a fan of Hero Hammer at all. That's not why I play these games. So that's why 5th edition ranks so low for me. And 8th edition's not really much better. For my campaigns, 2010, I started getting heavy into narrative campaigning and battle reports. So that required me to have to do some house rules. And I had a few house rules that I ran in my campaigns. And I was an event organizer, and I worked with Games Workshop, and we did events at the Games Workshop stores back then. And they used these house rules. And they let me use these house rules because the number of people we would attract to the campaign far exceeded the number of people that we attracted by just using tournament rules. And because of that, they were fine letting me do what I was doing because we had a lot bigger of a community. My Tamarkan campaign 2013, we had 52 people. The last campaign I ran was Lustria, and that was I think we had like 30 some odd registered, and we had 24 regulars. So our tournaments were anywhere between 12 and 15 people as a comparison. So these house rules are what I used in 8th edition, and I'll go over them and why. That made the game more fun from a narrative campaign stance. The first one was flanking or disruption negated steadfast. So what we were seeing is, what a lot of you were seeing in 8th edition, was these large, giant blocks of infantry just being shoved forward into the center of the table where they would smack with the other player's giant, large block of infantry until one of them broke. And there was a little bit more nuance than that, but that's distilling the game down to what it boiled down to in a lot of cases, and it just was not something that people wanted to do. That's not an army game. I don't even know what that is. Games Workshop having steadfast, I don't think was a bad idea. I think the problem was there was no counter to it. So because there was no counter to it and there was no unit blocks, there were no caps on the unit sizes, it became what it became. I'm a big proponent of counterplay. Like, I don't honestly care about mechanics as long as there's ways to counter those mechanics. And games don't just devolve into always do this or always do that. As another example for Cavalry in 7th edition, I would have loved to see something like Spears and Pikes have an anti-cavalry effect, which would have which would have negated people wanting to take all cavalry. Because if they ran across a spear wall, they would have been at a disadvantage, so they would have mixed their army up a little bit. So you can influence army composition in little tiny ways like that. But rule number 1 for me was steadfast was broken by disruption. So if I flank charged you, you weren't going to be steadfast even if you had 100 models and I only had 25. And that by itself naturally took care of the problem by itself. Number 2 problem we saw a lot of was not only were the games just big giant body blobs smacking into each other, everyone always had max levels of wizards. Everyone was always taking the wizard lords, and they were always going for the big kill spells. And then once they got those, because if you took a level 4 and a level 2, one of those two was going to have the big kill spell. Your tactic was essentially take 6 dice and throw it at that spell and hope for a double 6, because then it couldn't be dispelled. So that was your tactic. Both players throwing 6 dice, hoping to get Purple Sun off, and then devastate the opposition enough where they couldn't come back. Again, that takes away a lot of the tactics out of the game, because the game, there was no tactics really other than throw the dice. It was a dice game, and so people weren't having fun with that. So I brought back double 1s were miscasts, and they overrode double 6s. So if you got a double 1, it was just a straight miscast, and the spell failed to go off. That prevented people. That added an element of risk to throwing 6 dice all the time with no thought. The third major thing was that everyone would pack all 4 of their characters into one unit, because it's just easy to have the one mega Death Star unit. That's what we called them, Death Stars, because all your points were sunk into one unit, which made very one-dimensional play. It essentially made a game of War Machine where it was kill the caster, only it was kill the big king unit. And the first person who could do that basically won. So you couldn't put all your characters in one unit. I think in the campaigns back then we could put 2 characters in one unit as a max. But I like the 1 character per unit max, like Conquest does, just because it spreads your stuff around and you can't put all your eggs in one basket. Because that type of play really becomes one-dimensional, but really becomes really popular. So with those 3 house rules, we had really, really awesome campaigns. Probably some of the best times of my wargaming life were those campaigns. And yes, the tournament players hated them, and there was a lot of drama involved. But I think for what we gained out of it, I was fine taking the heat to have house rules, especially because those weren't tournaments; those were just campaigns. So my thing's always, if you don't want to play with those house rules, then just don't play. And go play tournaments or play whatever you want to play. This was just an alternate way of enjoying the Warhammer universe, and I stand by that today. Now, that's about 15 minutes of talking about all the history of the different Warhammers. Let's talk about Warhammer Army Project. Now, I'm using Warhammer Army Project right now to get back into the old world. And because I'm not really interested in 8th, and yeah, I could use those house rules, and that works fine. I've got the 8th edition rule book, but I looked through the Warhammer Army Project book, and I like a lot of their changes. So I'm going to go over some of the major changes and how those are going to influence the game. And when I do my first battle report coming up, you're going to see those rules in action. So, first thing I noticed out of the gate with Warhammer Army Projects versus 8th is that you are capped to 35% of your armies being allowed to be heroes and lords versus 50% in Warhammer 8th. So that really cuts down on the hero hammer, number 1. It also makes it so things like Nagash and Archeon and all the big super expensive models aren't showing up in 2,000 points to help scale those games a little bit better. So I'm a big fan of that. Second, they changed charging. So one of the big changes between 7th and 8th edition that made a lot of tournament players really, really mad was that it went from being a deterministic game where your charge distance was always just double your movement, and they made it random. Now, I honestly was a fan of the random, because the games of 7th they got very tired and boring to me, because it was pretty much playing the same game over and over again in my experience. And the randomness changed things up enough where it felt like every game was going to be a little bit different, and I could fail a charge that I normally shouldn't have failed. And to me, that was exciting because there was some risk in doing things again. And I enjoyed that. But I think their way of doing random charges was really too random. A lot of games have definitely moved away from that. But what the Warhammer Army Project does is you roll 2d6 and pick the highest and add that to your movement. So it's kind of a hybrid, and I think that's an acceptable change. And if you fail your charge, you'll move the highest dice rolled for movement. So that's kind of how charging's done in Warhammer Army Projects. Another big change: if you're charging into a fleeing enemy, it used to be if they were fleeing, they were destroyed. They would automatically flee. If I charged a fleeing unit, they would automatically roll a flee distance, and if I caught them, they were just blown up and destroyed. Here they go ahead and say, if I contact them, then the fleeing unit will take 2 wounds with no save of any kind for every point of unit strength the charging unit has. So a unit strength of 10 would do 20 wounds. I don't know that I necessarily care about that change, simply because most of the time that's going to be moot. That might be adding a little bit of complexity for the sake of complexity, but that way, I guess people didn't want to see their entire mega blob run down by 5 wolves, and that would stop that, I suppose. So that's fine. I mean, overall, I'm kind of on that rule, but I see why they did it. See, rallying will be like normal, except if you have 25% or less of your troops remaining, your leadership value is halved. That's different. So if I've knocked down your dwarf super leadership 10 guy, his unit's down to quarter strength. They're now leadership 5 to try to rally. Interesting. Let's see, what other big ones do we have here? I think this was still a part of 8th, but I'm not sure. But you can't march if an enemy's within 8 inches unless you do a leadership check. It's one of the things I've noticed in a lot of house rules and a lot of fan versions of the game is they made leadership matter more. And I love that because, in 6th edition, leadership seemed to matter more. They went a little bit overboard with a few things like fear, and I'll talk about that here in a minute with the change they did to fear. But like one of the things I hate about 40K is leadership almost doesn't even need to be in the game because there's no point in it. Like, it's so high that you're never going to fail, and when you do, it's such a minor inconvenience that I don't even understand why it's there in a lot of cases, for at least for a lot of armies. Some armies may actually suffer from it, but mostly I didn't see that. Leadership should be in wargaming huge. A big part of why I love War Master is the command checks. To do anything, you have to make a leadership check, and that's kind of how that would be commanding an army. If you're not making your leadership rolls, your components aren't going to know what to do. So I'm a big fan of that. Magic. We have wizards can choose their spells instead of randomize them. That's always been a giant complaint. However, the spell level of the wizard dictates how powerful they can cast. So I kind of like that as well. A lot of times in 8th edition, people wanted their 2nd level wizard to have the big nasty spell, because if they did, because everyone was rolling 6 dice to try to they called it 6 dicing for the win. If they could get the double 6 off, you still had to roll on that miscast table, and it was a 4 or less that you would die, because that's like a 13% chance. So obviously the risk versus reward is very low risk, very high reward, so everyone did it. But should you fail that roll, you're only losing a level 2, so that's not that big a deal. You're not giving up a lot of points. In this, if you want to cast those kill spells, you're going to have to be level 4. So I like that. I like that a lot. And level 2 spells can cast up to the 4th spell. So the more powerful your wizard, the more powerful the spells that they can get their hands on. So I like that. It doesn't have irresistible force any longer, which is great. I kind of, that gets rid of the 6 dice for the win. So what you're seeing is a lot of the things that I had house ruled, a lot of other people had problems with as well, because it just, to a lot of people, made the game very one-dimensional. So we're getting rid of 6 dicing for the win. We're getting rid of irresistible force. And Warhammer Army Project uses the concept of exploding dice. And what exploding dice is it every 6 I roll, I get to roll another die. But those dice themselves do not generate more values. So I can get a really high value if I roll a bunch of 6s because I can roll some more dice. So cool. If 2 or more 1s exist on a roll, it's considered a miscast. So depending on how many 1s you roll determines how potent the miscast can be, which is neat. Again, so it's like if the more dice I want to roll, the more there's a risk that I may blow my face off. and I am always going to be for that. I love risk reward, appropriate risk reward. You'll hear me complain a lot about super high powerful spells killing off enemy armies, and I don't think I'd care as much if there was an actual risk to using those. Like if I could actually detonate myself and half my army, and it wasn't a 13% chance to do it, but more, more commensurate with the damage I can do, I probably wouldn't care, because I love risk versus reward when it's done correctly. I don't like risk reward when it's very low risk for very high reward, and I understand why they're doing that. That's a game designer choice, because people like the low risk, high rewards. That's what they gravitate towards. So it sells more. It sells more units. Doesn't mean I like it though. Let's see what else is new. You can now. So if you shoot into a flank, this is shooting now, like missile weapons. If you're firing into a flank or the rear, opponent can't use shields. That may not be new. I can't remember. I seem to recall that you could always use shields, though. Now you can only use shields to the front. I like that rule. It makes positioning matter a whole lot more. You can fire into combat now. You can fire into an unengaged arc of an enemy unit, and Conquest allows you to do this as well. And I don't like how Conquest does it, because there's no penalty. It's just I can just fire into an enemy unit and kill them without risking hurting my friends. In this, I can fire into combat, but every one I roll to hit, I hit my friends instead. And that I like a lot. Now I have a risk. If I want to fire into a combat, I can hurt myself. And it's a 1 in 6 chance to hurt myself, but you know what? I can still do it, and it just feels a lot better. But it also gives me a tool or an option to use, because sometimes you want to fire into your own people. Braveheart had that very popular scene. We'll hit theirs as well. Attack. May never target enemies with templates if they're in combat, though. Okay. So those are the big shooting changes. Close combat. When you charge, you gain +1 initiative. That's your bonus for charging. Steadfast, they get rid of steadfast if you disrupt it, as long as you have a certain unit strength. So it's basically the house rule I was using, except you have to have like a unit strength of 10 or more. So you can't have like some tiny little unit of 5 dogs run into you. You actually have to have a unit strength of 10. So cavalry is a unit strength of 2 each. So a unit of 5 cavalry will be a unit strength of 10. But war beasts in this, which are like your hounds, only have a unit strength of 1. So 5 cheap little 30-point unit of hounds isn't going to break steadfast. But regardless, because you can have steadfast broken, that by itself influences how big people aren't going to sink 80 models of white lions into a unit and dump all 4 of their characters in it if they know they can get flanked and destroyed. So obviously love that change. Fear, another big change. Fear, you just gain +1 to your combat resolution. If the unit strength of the fear-causing unit is double or more of the unit strength of the enemy units, it'll be a +2 combat resolution. Fear is one of those things that has gone through pendulums where it was either entirely broken, like 6th edition, and I took advantage of that. That was my top 5 GT army. I placed 5th in a grand tournament with vampire counts, and all I had to do was charge all my big nasty things into you, win combat, and you would just automatically flee. So fear was broken. But then it swung to the other way where it was hardly useful at all. Now it just adds a point of combat resolution. That's fine. Frenzy, they changed it so you can try to restrain pursue by making a leadership check equal to their leadership roll minus how much they won by. So if you have a big unit of Khorne Berserkers and they win combat by 5, but you don't want to pursue, in 8th edition you'd have to pursue. You had to just charge forward because you're frenzied. In this edition, you don't have to do that. You can make a leadership roll, but you'll be at -5 because you won by 5. So the more you win by, the more frenzied you are in this, and the less likely you are to want to restrain yourself. So they give you a chance to hold back, and that's fine. I can see that as a thing that makes sense to me. Poison, instead of auto wounds on a 6 to hit, is now just +1 to wound. Regen is a special ward save now. Terror, if you're being charged at, the target unit must take a panic check or they'll flee. If you want to charge something that causes terror, you have to make a leadership check or you just won't charge. That's how the old fear and terror rules used to be. So they brought that back. That may have been what it was in 8th edition. I just don't remember. I remember terror being like fear, or it was terror light. It wasn't as big a deal. Whereas now it seems to be, big terrifying greater demon coming at you makes a big difference now. Weapon changes. There's a bunch of weapon changes, and I am not going to roll through all these, but really the gist of the weapon changes is that most weapons only give you a bonus on the first round of combat, and then they basically turn into normal weapons. There's some differences, like halberds, you'll always get the +1 to your strength, just like always. Great weapons, you get +2 strength on the first turn and then just +1 afterwards. The big one I love, and I mentioned earlier, if only spears and pikes existed to be, anti-cavalry. Well, now I'm not going to say that they're totally anti-cavalry, but they're definitely useful against cavalry. They brought pikes back, which is great. Spears get a +1 initiative, so charging gives you a +1 initiative, but spears give you a +1 initiative. Lances give them +2 initiative, so a lanced arm unit is still going to go through spears first. But the spears get a strength bonus if charged in its front, and pikes get a +3 initiative and fight in 3 ranks and get a strength bonus if charged to their front. So they are a little bit more anti-cavalry, and I like those rules a lot. Armor, they've basically added light, medium, and heavy armor, and then you have plate armor, which is another category unto itself. So light armor is just a 6-up save, medium's 5-up, heavy armor is 4-up, and plate is 3-up. You also have shields, which add 1 to your armor, but you can't use in your flank or your rear. And you have the parry rule if you have a hand weapon, just like you did in past editions. So you'll have a ward save of a 6-up if you have a hand weapon and shield. They changed some command model rules up a little bit to make the command models more useful, and you want to actually take them other than for their +1 attack. So that's cool. I'm not really wild about the War Machine rules. They still don't use the cruise ballistic skill. I prefer War Machines using the cruise ballistic skill. I think Age of Sigmar got that right. Because people used to argue all the time about those arrow dice and all the time about how many people were really hit by the template. And I just avoid that now. I would just rather say, oh, I hit you and I did D6 hits, because no one can argue about those. Forests, they changed. So in 8th edition, something that drove me crazy. Forests didn't block line of sight anymore. So you could just shoot light cannons right through forests, and there was nowhere to hide. So it was one reason why you didn't see a lot of monsters. Now they've added it so woods by default you can see up to 5 inches in. I added, for myself, I will have heavy woods, which you can see in 2 inches, because I think you need both distinguishing things, and you need places you can hide on the map so that cannons just can't shoot whatever they want to shoot. And then the last big change was the victory conditions for your standard games. So your units are still worth their points if you kill them. They're worth half their points if you take them down to half strength. But they give you, if your fleeing units are greater than 50% in strength, they're only worth half the points. So one of the things that used to annoy people was turn 6, very end turn of the game, I made your big expensive unit flee. You can't rally. Oh, I get all those points. That was aggravating. So now they're saying if that unit was greater than 50% of its starting size, then it will be worth only half of its points. So those are some of the major changes I noticed, and you'll see me use most of those in the upcoming battle report. But let me know your thoughts on Warhammer Army projects, these changes, how they differ from 8th, what you think about them, and what you're kind of looking for at the old world, which is supposed to be based off of 7th edition with some elements of 6th and 8th put in. I'm very curious as to what that means and how they make that work. But yeah, the next video coming out should be a battle report, and I'm looking forward to doing that report. Be facing an AI opponent that is the AI behind the Unreal game I wrote. I taught it how to play Warhammer. It makes army lists. It uses a machine learning program I use to calculate power coefficients in army lists. I'm excited to try it out and show it off a little bit. Granted, the army report won't actually show it playing. I'm just going to take the highlights of the game and kind of condense them because I'm not really a big fan of watching people try to play on Tabletop Simulator. It's very fiddly, but I am looking forward to having that put out probably next week here. So thanks for sticking around. Thanks for watching. I look forward to your comments. And until next time, I'll see you guys later. Thanks.